Hi, I'm Chris Taylor. I'm Technical Development Director at Vital Energy, and I'm going to be talking about the Carnot Gas Plant. The partners within this project it was SGN as lead partner, Vital Energy looking at the technical aspects of the generation plant, Imperial College London doing some whole system modelling, University of Birmingham focusing on compression and liquefaction, and then two councils, Glasgow City Council and Western Berkshire Council, who were giving a perspective on the potential use of the technology within their areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so the problem, as we're going towards net zero, there's been sort of several models done, including ones by Imperial College that look at what the future network is going to need. So there's an established requirement for import and export flexibility within the network, such as provided by batteries. There's still expected to be a need for open cycle gas turbine plants and combined cycle turbine plants in 2050 for extended periods of low renewable generation. There's going to be a need for demand side only flexibility as hours of excess generation increase. That's coming from National Grid. If you look at their modeling in some of their future energy scenarios, the suggestion is, so as of today, we currently have longer periods of excess demand than we do of excess generation. But as we start to effectively over-install wind power, there's going to be increasing periods of over generation on the grid, and therefore an increasing need for demand side only response, which doesn't have the requirements such as a battery does to put that power back onto the grid. And there's going to be a need for decarbonisation of sort of higher temperature heat, which is also part of the solution. All of the above activities are important, but if you consider them completely in isolation, then you might end up with sort of single function assets which cease operating as the market changes over sort of the coming years and decades. You can end up with higher CO2 production from flexibility, and increase the amount of the infrastructure both at transmission and distribution level for both power and gas. And then you're going to have increased timescales of connecting these flexible assets, including heat networks, onto these grids. Next slide, please. So what our project does is it looks at decoupling the compression cycle of a gas turbine from the time of generation. So what a gas turbine does is it has a turbine on one end, which is the work generator, the power generator, and then that sort of directly drives a compressor at the time of use. So when the turbine's running, it sucks in ambient air, compresses that down, which increases its pressure and temperature, and then combusts that with natural gas, and then sends that hot pressurized gas through a turbine, which is connected to a generator, which produces electricity. What that means is that sort of circa 50% of the work done by the turbine is to drive that compressor. And when you're producing power with gas, natural gas in the sort of majority current case, then 50% of that gas is being used to drive the compressor. That leads to CO2 emissions related to the compression cycle. So what our project is doing is looking at replacing the compression cycle with a liquefaction process. What the modeling's shown is that can reduce the gas consumption by 50%, which obviously reduces the CO2 emissions if you're using natural gas, and it minimises H2 hydrogen consumption if you're using hydrogen in future energy scenarios. It also means, so for example, with open cycle gas plants, I think the utilization of those in these future energy scenarios is going to be low. There'll be a low number of hours for these sort of periods of extended low renewables generation. It's therefore not particularly economical to gather the excess heat that those produce, either through heat recovery into a steam turbine or into a network, because they themselves are so intermittent. What this process allows you to do is to alternate the size between the gas plant, the actual generation plant, and the liquefaction process. So you can have, whilst the generator might be working for a low number of hours or a reduced number of hours in the year, the actual liquefaction process, which generates the heat, can then be used for an increased number of hours, which makes gathering that heat and using it in useful situations more achievable. Next slide, please. So the users of this technology, high temperature heat users, as we've said, the liquefaction process has the ability to generate higher temperatures of heat than would be seen by a heat pump, for example, or achievable efficiently by a heat pump. And that's one of the key difficult areas for heat decarbonisation. There's one which I think I've covered up with the picture here, but one of the users is the flexible asset owner, and what they'll be left with is an asset which is more flexible and more able to respond to future changes to the network with a more diverse business case. And the electrical grid is going to provide them with storage and flexible generation, and also increase the amount of demand side only response through this sort of flexible asset. Next slide, please. Okay, so the project activities we did, we modeled the project using software called Plexos. This is an optimization engine, and it's used by the National Grid to model network growth. We used the model to look at a number of different scenarios and ratios, and try to understand what the optimal balance really between the size of the liquefaction plant, the amount of storage you'd need, and then the size of the generator. What the modeling allows us to do is to simulate real world trading scenarios over multiple markets. So that's day ahead, balancing mechanism, intraday. So actually the model runs multiple different scenarios which are layered on top of each other. So that's a much more realistic modeling of it than compared to some of the other modeling which we've done currently. To do this, we used 25-year forecast data for all of those markets, which were provided by Baringa. And then we modeled, as I said, we modeled full 25-year for the plant using that data, and also using some gas pricing data also provided by Baringa. We wanted to model the heat recovery for this. We wanted to pick a project or something that we had a lot of detailed data on in terms of sort of half-hourly, ideally, data for both heat and power as well. And we wanted that to be a higher temperature user. So a lot of the networks that Vital Energy currently provide heat for are hospitals, and because of their distribution networks, a lot of them are steam distribution, and they have these high central temperatures. What the modeling showed was that the heat demand for on-site was higher than the demand for, the heat demand results showed an excess of cryogenic air, which was produced if you were trying to meet the heat demand. So what we were trying to initially look at was whether these things could be based next to a site, which allowed us to better access the heat for use there. However, what it showed was that yes, we could meet the demands of the site, but then if you had an on-site generator, then to meet their power demands using the technology described above, there'd be an excess of cryogenic air that was produced. So we looked at having an off-site solution as well, and we found that ratios of sort of between 5 to 1 and 10 to 1 between the liquefaction plant and the generator was about right. So 5 to 1 being, if you had a 50 megawatt generator offsite, you would have a 10 megawatt import liquefaction plant. We actually looked at 3 different scenarios. One which was how this would run just out of interest if none of the heat was recovered, and whether that was commercially viable using the numbers that we had. And in fact, that actually showed that did run. We modeled a central site only scenario, whereby it would be connected to a sort of larger district heating network from a centralized 50 megawatt plant. And we also looked at, as I said, this off-site potential solution. And then we looked into the ability to potentially transport the cryogenic air from the site where the heat was being used to the central location for generation. Next slide, please. So in terms of the major equipment specification, when we were looking at the turbine cycle, we produced an Excel version of the turbine cycle, and we looked at varying the pressure ratios, inlet temperatures, inlet pressures, and the number of stages to see what the optimum use is. And we found we used recuperation of the gas turbine exhaust to preheat what is cold air coming from the liquid air, the cryogenic air storage, it going into the turbine. What that meant is that that's beneficial in that the exhaust heat produced by the gas turbine at the point of generation can be also used at the point of generation, and we don't have to then connect that into a heat network, and there aren't as many losses, because obviously, as I said before, recovering that heat in a normal open cycle gas turbine process, because of how intermittent it is, isn't particularly cost effective. We had a strong desire to repurpose of existing equipment. Both A, we didn't want to be designing new turbo generators, and B, it would give us the potential to look at this thing for a retrofit type solution of existing open cycle gas turbines. And in the end, we selected a 2-stage process whereby you pump up the cryogenic air to high pressures. In this case, we chose 120 bar. You send that, you heat that slightly to about 500 degrees C, and send that through an expander down to about 30 bar, and then send that into a normal gas turbine combustor and expansion process. We looked at all those different scenarios for a fixed amount of inlet air. So I had a fixed size of liquefaction process, and the estimated cost for this was for this 66 megawatt export was, with a 10 megawatt import liquefaction plant, was under 30 million, which is in and around the cost of an open cycle gas turbine, which would also export 66 megawatts. Next slide, please. We looked at the whole system impact of this using Imperial College's whole energy system model. What that did was that had a counterfactual, which didn't use the technology at all, and the case that we were looking for, which was assuming 15 gigawatts of Carnot Gas Plant being available to the system to use, and it operated the Carnot Gas Plant on a hydrogen. They used the net zero leading the way scenario and their deep electrification of heat scenario for this, and it compares the generation mix to distribution and transmission costs for all these. What that showed was there was a £2.9 billion a year benefit to the system, which comes from 1.3 billion savings of low carbon generation, 1.2 billion a year in distribution network reinforcements, and 0.5 billion a year in the hydrogen system. What the graphs on the right show is how that is achieved. So what happens is when the Carnot Gas Plant is available, there's a displacement of the hydrogen-powered open cycle gas turbines and the hydrogen combined cycle gas turbines. You can't quite see the numbers on this one there, but effectively it takes about 50% of, it's about a 50% split, so you end up with about 7 gigawatts replacement of the combined cycle and 7 gigawatts replacement of the open cycle. Next slide, please. So the findings, what we found was that the Carnot Gas Plant, which includes the turbine generator, liquefaction plant, and the storage, has a comparable capex to equivalent size GT. It also provides a 50% reduction in the gas consumption per megawatt generated by the open cycle gas turbine. That's at the point of generation, and doesn't include for anything on the liquefaction side. It's suitable for either natural gas or hydrogen, so we can evolve as the energy market evolves. The liquefaction process can be optimized and designed to match process conditions, so you can look at altering the compression cycles and the pressure ratios to produce a different temperature, was effectively cooling on the cooling of the liquefaction process. A small on-site turbine could provide some power demand, although some would have to be transported off-site in that version of the model. And a large off-site gas plant acts as a peaking plant, replacing, as I mentioned before, open cycle gas turbines and combined cycle. As the cryogenic air is so dense, it is suitable for transport from this distributed site to a central location. What we found for a 10 megawatt import, there was about 25 traffic movements per day. In terms of return on investment, that was provided for all of the cases, even the case where there's no heat, which is recovered at all. The liquefaction plant runs when the demand price is, the energy pricing is low enough, wastes the heat because in that case there's no way to use it, and then burns the gas and uses the liquefied air when the power prices are higher. And we can also found that this was very well suited for using existing equipment, either repurposing something new or retrofitting something old. Next slide, please. In terms of the next steps, firstly, we're going to need to look at the preferred turbine and expander, which we would like to use in the beta stage. So the alpha stage will act really as a front end engineering design process for what would be the beta phase. We're going to look more into the value of recuperation and see if additional capex investment makes sense. So what we did was we tried to reduce the cost of the recuperator by reducing the heat exchanger effectiveness. So increasing the heat exchanger effectiveness recovers more of the heat coming from the turbine exhaust and reduces the amount of gas, so it improves the gas efficiency. And there'll be a balance there between the utilization of the asset and how much it's worth spending on that recuperation cycle. And that will change from sort of different business cases, but we'll do a more detailed assessment of that in the next stage. As I said, we're going to do a front-end engineering design. This will be of the proposed commercial product with a liquefaction plant on site somewhere with a small turbine and an off-site storage and turbines. What we think we'll do for the beta stage is just focus on an on-site smaller liquefaction plant located with a small turbine. That should demonstrate the commercial and technical functionality of the whole process, and demonstrate that an off-site process is possible, but obviously does so at a smaller size and with a reduced investment requirement. We're going to select the location for the beta project from which we'll develop from. Again, as I said, that'll be a smaller site with a smaller turbine, and we'll look for something with a heat demand, ideally someone we're already involved with, such as a hospital or a university. And we'll provide details to the Net Zero Community Energy Hubs project, which I'll be talking on later, in terms of how the Carnot Gas Plant could form part of one of those hubs and interact with other flexible assets within a sort of small location. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to move on to Q&A now. 5 or so minutes of Q&A. I'm just going to bring open the Q&A box. So this question is from Rob. In terms of locating these plants, has consideration been given to co-location with flexible uses of heat? He's thinking things like sugar refining, something that might be able to use heat if and when it's available.
Yes. To be honest, the focus has been on heat users that we know, i.e. existing clients of Vital Energy, for which we have heat and power solutions on their site. There's a need for a kind of something that replaces the CHP, and is the sort of can provide both power and heat to replace that. Those are sort of, say, flexible heat users. What we looked at was putting flexibility within the heat generation in the form of some storage, and then trying to meet the demands of the users when they arrive. So in the case, I think in one of the slides shown, what we had was a full half-hourly heat profile for one of the hospitals, and then we looked at making sure we met that profile with the heat capture from the liquefaction plant and associated storage. There's no reason why it couldn't be co-located with something like a sugar refining plant. The thing you have to balance really is the demands of the grid and kind of the pricing of the power and the demands of the plant. If you've got the liquefaction plant looking like it would ideally want to run at times of increased generation and low pricing on the grid, and that doesn't match up with the heat demands of the end user, then you end up looking at increasing amount of heat storage. I think there's lots of people out there, both sort of public sector, commercial processes, which have a fairly constant heat demand. We have clients now who are looking to decarbonize their heating, but if they have anything above 90 degrees C, then suddenly including a heat pump doesn't look as attractive because the efficiency is reduced quite considerably. So what we were looking at here was something that could potentially meet those higher temperature demands, and because they're incorporated in another wider system, not directly there solely to serve the heat needs, there are efficiencies, the commercial efficiencies that can be gained, and we think we're in a pretty good position to provide people, certainly the modelling shows we're in a good position to provide these customers with decarbonised heat at a lower price than they would be able to get otherwise.